Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to this event, which is the third event in a series called Life Online Today and Tomorrow. This series forms part of the 5-year Ego Media project, which is funded by the European Research Council and hosted by the Centre for Life Writing Research at King's College London. The series will continue over the next year, and details of future events are on the Ego Media website, as you'll see later. My name is Max Saunders, and I co-direct the Centre for Life Writing Research with my colleague Claire Brandt. This is the second of two roundtable discussions put on by the Ego Media Project's international network of life writing experts. And that network brings together leading experts from Europe, the USA, China, Australia, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. Tonight we're going to hear from three of the most distinguished figures who've all been very much involved in the International Autobiography Association, IABA, or YABA for short, and sort of setting up its international conferences and other events. They are Gillian Whitlock, Alfred Hornung, and Craig Howes, and all extremely well published scholars. If I went into details about their publication list, we'd be here all night, so I'm just going to give some highlights as I introduce them. And what I'll do is I'll introduce them all to start with, and then they'll speak for, I think, about 15 minutes or so each on their individual topics, and then they'll have a discussion amongst themselves and ask each other questions, and then after that we'll open up questions to the audience. The theme today is going to be voices and ethics, thinking particularly of life online. Gillian Whitlock is professor at the School of Communication and Arts, the University of Queensland, and her research focuses on the fields of life narrative, including autobiography and biography, post-colonial studies, and women's writing. She's the author of Post-Colonial Life Narratives, Testimonial Transactions from 2015, Soft Weapons, Autobiography in Transit from 2006, and The Intimate Empire, Reading Women's Autobiography from the year 2000. And in her recent research, she discusses 21st century testimony. Alfred Hornung is a professor and chair of American Studies in the Department of English and Linguistics at the Johannes Gutenberg University. His latest publications are American Lives from 2013, Ecology and Life Writing, also 2013, and Medialisierung Formen des Autobiographischen from 2013. He's particularly interested at the moment in the performance of life writing in television programs and their pedagogical intentions for health and ecology. But he also is going to talk tonight about a new project he set up on life sciences and life writing. Craig Howes is professor in the Department of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and director for the Centre of Biographical Research there. And he's also co-editor of the journal Biography, an interdisciplinary quarterly. And on top of all that, he runs the IABA listserv, which is the main sort of conduit for information about life writing for the whole sort of profession of scholars working in that field. With Miriam Fuchs, he co-edited a book called Teaching Life Writing, published in 2008, and an earlier book, Voices of the Vietnam POWs, from Oxford in 1993. More recently, he's been working on the political, ethical, and cultural dynamics of journal publication, and more specifically, what materials are being most heavily used by researchers working in online archives of scholarly journals. And on top of all that, as if that wasn't enough, he's been working on television documentaries and online information support for living history presentations. So it's a great pleasure to welcome the three of you to King's and to the Centre for Life Writing Research and to this series. And I'd like to ask Gillian to start off by giving her presentation.
Thanks, Max, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a big responsibility to give a paper in the last session where we've heard so much and there's so much to carry forward. What I'm going to do here briefly is take forward some of the ethical issues that were raised by the paper I gave this morning, The Hospitality of Cyberspace. But we're going to begin with close reading of a letter. So I'm saying that because I won't be speaking about new media as much as you might think for an ego media project, but I see this as part of a larger project of thinking about 21st century testimony, where there are artefacts of all kinds. So what you can see here is a letter from the archive where I work, the Elaine Smith collection at the Frye Library at the University of Queensland. And this is a collection of letters, photographs, artwork, maps from the detention centre on Nauru, the remote island in Micronesia where Australia has a detention centre for the mandatory detention of asylum seekers who arrive by boat. So this archive is materials from 2001 to 2006, after which Nauru closed, and the humanitarian activists who generated these materials said, well, that was a dark age, we can now gift these materials to an archive and then move on. And the detention centre was opened again in 2009. It is open now. There's a Senate inquiry on at the moment. It is infamous for the evidence that's coming forward of suffering, trauma and abuse that's happening at Nauru now. But the archive I work in is papers from 2001 to 2006, and that will be relevant to some of the things I'm going to say. So, the project I'm working on is called The Testimony of Things, and some of you will have heard me speak about other things in the archive, and you're looking at a letter. So what you see here is a letter written by a 9-year-old boy in detention on Nauru to the humanitarian activist Elaine Smith, who gifted this archive of letters and photographs and artwork. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a correspondence, so this is not the first letter. They've been exchanging letters for a while. What you can see there, those black blocks on the page, are where names are redacted, which is an ethical issue. We must redact names of asylum seekers in any material that we show, or any images. We must blur the face. And it's important to read with redactions. They're not just incidental to the condition of this writer. And I would compare this to an amazing book that was published earlier this year, which some of you will know, Guantanamo Diary, where you must read with redactions. The pages of Guantanamo Diary are, I would suggest to you, similar to this, where material is blocked out, where you have a kind of incidental daily form of writing, almost a banal form, letter, diary, being put to testimonial ends. So if I'm building a case for 21st century testimony, I think that camp is an essential location, and I think it is using these fragmented forms. What we see here, redacted his name, but you can see that number at the top, 3306, which is his boat, and that would be used to identify him in the camp, and he automatically puts this on the letter, although it means nothing to Elaine Smith. So this number lets us know that he was on a boat that was intercepted late in 2001. He was shipped across a 14-day voyage in Customs and Border Patrol vessel, shipped from the Indian Ocean right across to the Pacific Ocean to the remote island of Nauru. So that number is his identity. It's a sign of incarceration and dehumanisation that carries on even to this correspondence, which is shaped in terms of a humanitarian exchange. That what you are actually looking at there are not 2 pages, this is 1 page, and you've got a photograph from each side. But it is almost now illegible. What we're seeing is the degradation of this, the blue biro on an exercise book. The envelope is attached to this in the archive, and if Margaretta were here, Margaretta and Liz Stanley, who've worked on letters, they would insist we talk about the whole beast, you know, from snout to tail. The envelopes are an important part of this collection of letters, the epistolarium. So the envelope is attached to this letter with its gaudy tropical Nauru stamp. So we have two sides of the one page here, and you have a foot map. So this 9-year-old boy has drawn a foot map of the foot of his baby brother. What we are reading here is what I would call broken English. It's an English learned in the camp English, but there's also an orality, an incantatory kind of quality that I hope you'll hear when I read it shortly. I've been using Margaretta, Jolly and Liz Stanley's work on the epistolarium, which some of you might know. The epistolarium is a collection of letters, and Margaretta and Liz talk about the mutual metonymy of letter writer and addressee. Mutual metonymy, one sort of bringing the other into being. So, of course, the power of this artefact that we're looking at is that it is a letter. We can think in terms of a performative construction of self by both writer and recipient here. So this is a sent to Elaine Smith by this boy. So this is a correspondence. It's creating a connection between the asylum seeker and someone whose citizenship is predicated on his exclusion and his mandatory detention. So let me read it. My mother, you said that when your father is angry on you, is there anyone who can look after you? No, my mother, there isn't anyone. My uncle made me happy, and he'd take my father to his home. When my father came, his home was a little better. When my uncle Abdul has gone, no one is here to look after. I am forced that I should be with him because we have a problem when my father gets angry. Then I shout and laugh from my father. He will be a little better, then he will not hit me when his mind is okay. He likes me a lot, my grandmother. I will send a photo, and with it, my brother. He can walk, my grandmother. Could you send me shoe for my brother? And also, could you send me shoes for when I go to school? So let me take up then one of the ethical issues that is before us here, the question of voice. Now, Lisa Malki, the anthropologist whose field work is in refugee camps in Tanzania, it's important that she's working from within camps, draws a sharp distinction between testimonial voice, which she defines as the ability to establish a narrative authority over one's own circumstances and future, an ability to lay claim to an audience. They're things she associates with testimonial voice. And the discourses of audibility and visibility that are made available through humanitarian witness. So this letter is speaking in terms of discourses of availability that become available through humanitarian witness. Voice, Lisa Malki argues, establishes the authority, the political agency and the communal memory that energises the testimony that Malki hears from within the camp, where a refugee status is an important historical identity that shapes the collective as a people. We've talked a lot about agency and tentatively with different kinds of theories about it over the last couple of days, but Malki is talking about a testimonial of voice that allows agency for refugee people. What Malki is particularly concerned about is the dehistoricisation and depoliticisation of refugees when they become objects of care and control. And she attaches to these a label which is important in refugee studies, silent emissaries. So she's concerned about when refugees become silent emissaries in a humanitarian imaginary, where they become visualised as spectacles in a bare humanity, a kind of anonymous corporeality that is faceless and nameless. So Malky asks an important ethical question. Can we envisage a radically historicising humanism that exists on not acknowledging not only the suffering of these people, but also their narrative authority, their historical agency, and their political memory? Can we think of testimonial voices of refugees rather than speechless emissaries? Now, I would argue that in this letter we can see some features of what Malky would call that testimonial voice. It is a haunting account of suffering. The addressee of this letter, Elaine Smith, says it was one of the most piercing letters she received in the 5 years she was conducting a correspondence with people in the camp. But we can also see that there are tactics at work amongst the asylum seekers in the camp. The uncle comes and removes the father. The boy has these tactics that he uses to distract his father. The boy knows that he needs to reassure Elaine Smith that his father cares for him, he loves him. So we see an account of suffering, but we also see resilience. We see the tactics that manage his father's mental illness amongst the family of the people. We see a caring and tenderness in its appeal on behalf of his brother. So this letter is full of emotion. And there is then the foot map that he draws, which is surely part of, if it was an image, it's a punctum, it's what's so one of the piercing features of this letter. The visual culture scholar Nicholas Mertzov argues that we must learn to see the Anthropocene, we must learn to see the age that is caused by the activity of humanity on the environment. This too is part of the poignancy of this foot map, this imprint of the Anthropocene. These asylum seekers are in indefinite detention in a camp in a degraded environment. The camp is located close to an exhausted phosphate mine on Nauru. This ground is hard and sharp. The physicality of their detention becomes real here in this embodied and eloquent micro-narrative. As some of you may know, in her recent book on environmentalism, Naomi Klein uses Nauru as an example of a state of degradation. It's not only a failed state politically. What was once a lush tropical island has been mined to the point of exhaustion. There is no fresh water. All of the supplies they need are flown in for the residents and for the people in the camp. So we can feel this wasted land here. The letter speaks to the slow violence of environmental degradation and also the spectacular violence of offshoring asylum seekers. But there's another aspect to this footprint. It also resonates with Western imaginative geographies embedded in colonial modernity. The footprint on the island reminds us of Crusoe. There are Pacific mythographies attached to first landings and the imprint and shoes on the beach. This is part of a kind of Pacific mythography also. But here in this letter, the footprint becomes what Anne Laura would call imperial debris. It is a kind of accumulation of the various kinds of colonisation that have gone on here, including the Australian neo-colonialism of establishing this detention centre. Finally, on the footprint, there's the particular poignancy of the figure of the child invoked in this letter. We have a sentimental attachment to first steps as the baby becomes a toddler, a privilege denied this family where the toddler will learn to walk on this inhospitable space. But I have a question about this. So this is a close reading of the letter. We're now beginning the process of digitising some of the asylum seeker letters, and I'd like to raise questions about the ethical issues connected to this, what this might allow, and what problems might arise. What might happen to this letter when we move to distant reading? For example, we will lose the footprint. So, the framework of this epistolarium is a collective of letters which, as I've been suggesting, gives a graphic insight into the life of the camp. What we're hoping will happen when we digitise some of these letters and begin to analyse them as data is we will get some different insights into the life of the camp, which is, after all, a cold case. We're working in an archive. Firstly, we're hoping that it will reveal the collective process that engineers this epistolarium. Most of these asylum seekers are illiterate. How many scribes were there? And how? There's no signature of handwriting on many of these letters. It's the absence of signature that counts, an authenticating device that is absent on most of these letters. So, by digitising this collection, it might reveal the networks of collaborative composition of orality and literacy in the camp. We might also get some insight into formulae for the letters that might be working through that community and shaping these letters in ways that we won't perceive from reading them individually in close reading. Secondly, I'm wondering if by digitising these letters we might get some insight into the affective life of the camp. Not just the dynamics within an individual family or the particular one-on-one correspondence between this boy and Elaine Smith, but from slow reading, from close reading, I think we can vaguely perceive the emotional life of the camp. But maybe by digitising, we'll be able to get a more macrocosmic view of the slow violence of these wasted lives. And that's what you see happening from 2001 across to 2004. What washes through is there's a time when they can make application for refugee status, and the feedback from the International Office of Migration and the Australian Department of Immigration, when those results come back, you feel, even across individual letters, that wave of desolation that happens to the majority of them. So I'm wondering if in some ways by collecting reading across this epistolarium, we will begin to get an insight into the growing incidence of mental illness and medication that happens in the camp, and also the episodes of grief and loss that happen when flights go out. So repatriation is one of the major tactics for managing this population. They're offered $2,000 to fly back to Pakistan or Kabul. We're talking about 2002, 2003 here. I mean, these people had left Afghanistan and Pakistan for good reasons, but $2,000 they are offered to return, and slowly they take it. They take it partly because many of them become worried about what's happening to them. But when a flight of 30 people leave, you feel the increasing despair of those who remain. So I wonder if digitisation might allow us to track the volume of letters and their frequency, whether it will allow us to map what I know is a point of intensity that happens late in 2002 when a group of asylum seekers go on hunger strike and lip-stitch their lips. And I know how that increases the traffic of letters, but I'm not able to quantify that, and I think it would be interesting to do that. The final thing I'm wondering if we might be able to get some insight into is this camp is sort of the archive is at a threshold in the coming of new technologies. So most of the letters from the camp, from the asylum seekers, are handwritten, but some computers are introduced to the camp, and they're given some very limited access which is used as a means of control. But so I'm interested in the coexistence of print and email that we see in this archive, and what will that enable us to learn? So what will be the ethical issues of digitising these letters? There are a number of concerns there, partly because reading each of these individually, recognising the cultural, historical force of each of these correspondence seems important. The final point I want to make then would be about 21st century testimony. I've been very taken with Judith Butler's work on what she calls shards of testimony. And this is in her essay on indefinite detention, where she talks about Guantanamo poems that were originally written on styrofoam cups. But there was a volume of Guantanamo poems published, I think, about 2009. And Judith Butler writes about these in terms of shards of testimony. I like that metaphor. I think it works for things like this letter, for things like Guantanamo Diary, things that are piercing and sharp and fragmented and redacted. So that's my growing theory, that we might want to begin to think about a 21st century testimony which is coming from the black sites and the grey zones of detention that are the legacy of so much part of the long war on terror. Thank you.